The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the marble walls as 18-year-old Claudia adjusted her flame-colored wedding veil one final time. The saffron fabric felt heavier than usual against her shoulders, weighted down not by its material, but by the knowledge of what awaited her beyond the bronze doors of her new husband's villa. She had been told this was tradition. She had been assured this was normal. What no one had bothered to explain was why her mother had wept while braiding her hair that morning, or why the elder women of her family exchanged those knowing glances whenever the wedding night was mentioned. In just a few hours, Claudia would discover that Roman marriage contained secrets so disturbing that historians would spend centuries trying to pretend they never existed. Behind the public celebrations and joyous processions lay a private ceremony so invasive and humiliating that even Roman writers struggled to describe it directly. Tonight, she would learn that becoming a Roman wife meant submitting to rituals that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with legal verification. What happened in Roman bedchambers during wedding nights was not romance. It was documentation. It was not intimacy. It was inspection. And by morning, Claudia would understand exactly why generations of Roman women carried their wedding night memories in complete silence, taking their experiences to the grave, rather than speak of what they had endured. Before we dive deeper into this buried chapter of Roman history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about ancient Rome. The empire that gave us law and order also created marriage rituals so shocking that early Christians worked tirelessly to erase every trace of them from historical memory. But fragments survived, and today we're going to uncover the terrifying truth about what really happened when Roman brides crossed the threshold into their new lives. The story begins not with violence or cruelty, but with beauty and ceremony. Roman weddings were spectacular affairs that could last for days, filled with religious rituals, elaborate feasts, and public celebrations that demonstrated the wealth and status of both families involved. The bride would spend hours being prepared by skilled slaves who knew exactly how to arrange her hair in the traditional 6 braids, each one separated with a spear point and secured with woolen ribbons that had been blessed by the temple priests. Her wedding dress, the tunica recta, was woven on an ancient loom using techniques passed down through generations of Roman women. Every thread had been spun by her own hands during the months leading up to the ceremony, and the fabric itself was considered sacred, imbued with protective powers that would shield her from evil spirits and ensure fertility in her new marriage. Over this foundation garment, she wore the palla, a cloak that marked her new status as a married woman, and finally the flammeum, that distinctive flame-colored veil that announced to everyone she encountered that this was her wedding day. The public ceremony took place at the temple, where priests examined the entrails of sacrificial animals to determine whether the gods approved of the union. Favorable omens were essential, and if the signs were bad, the entire wedding could be postponed or even cancelled. Assuming the gods smiled upon the match, the bride and groom would exchange vows using formulas so ancient that many Romans no longer understood their original meaning. The bride would speak the traditional words that formally transferred her from her father's legal authority to her husband's control, a phrase that translated roughly to "where you are, there I am also." But these public ceremonies, magnificent as they were, represented only the beginning of the marriage process. Roman law was extremely specific about what constituted a valid marriage, and a temple ceremony alone was not sufficient. The union had to be consummated, and that consummation had to be verified by witnesses who could later testify in court if the marriage's validity was ever questioned. This legal requirement created a system of wedding night rituals that were unlike anything practiced in the modern world. After the temple ceremony concluded, the wedding procession would wind through the streets of Rome as the sun began to set. Crowds of citizens would line the roads, throwing nuts and flowers while singing traditional songs that were deliberately crude and sexually explicit. These verses, known as Fescennine songs, were believed to ward off evil spirits through their shocking content, but they also served to prepare the bride psychologically for what was coming. The lyrics left nothing to the imagination, describing in graphic detail what would happen once she reached her husband's house. As the procession approached the villa where the consummation would take place, the bride might notice that far more people than expected seemed to be following them inside. Roman marriage law required witnesses to observe not just the ceremony, but also its completion. And these witnesses were not merely symbolic attendees. They had specific legal duties that required them to pay close attention to everything that happened throughout the night. The moment the bride crossed the threshold of her new home, she entered a space that had been carefully prepared for what Roman legal scholars called the final verification. The atrium would be filled with people she had never met before, each one serving a specific function in the elaborate ritual that was about to unfold. There would be a pronuba, an older married woman whose job was to oversee every aspect of the consummation process. There would be a priest whose role was to ensure that all religious requirements were properly fulfilled. There would be slaves trained in the specific duties required for wedding night assistance. And most ominously, there would be a physician with medical instruments whose purpose would become clear soon enough. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the presence of a draped wooden figure standing in the corner of the room, hidden beneath heavy cloth, but unmistakably shaped like something the bride was not prepared to encounter. This object, whose purpose would be revealed within the hour, represented one of the most shocking aspects of Roman wedding night traditions, a ritual so disturbing that even pagan Roman writers struggled to describe it directly. The bride would be led to a room where she would meet this hidden figure face to face, and what happened next would challenge every assumption she had about marriage, intimacy, and her own bodily autonomy. The wooden idol beneath the cloth was not merely decorative, it was functional, and the bride's interaction with it would be observed, documented, and remembered by witnesses who might be called upon to testify about what they had seen for years to come. This is where the story of Roman marriage diverges completely from our modern understanding of wedding nights. What we imagine as a private moment between husband and wife was, in ancient Rome, a public legal procedure designed to create unshakable evidence that the marriage had been properly consummated. The bride's comfort, emotions, or consent were irrelevant to this process. She was property being transferred from one man to another, and like all valuable property, she had to be inspected, verified, and documented before the transfer could be considered complete. The wooden figure waiting beneath the cloth was dedicated to Mutinus Tutinus, a Roman deity whose worship was so embarrassing to later generations that most references to him were deliberately obscured or destroyed. This god presided over sexual initiation and fertility, but his worship involved practices that even Roman writers found difficult to discuss openly. The bride's encounter with this idol was not symbolic or metaphorical. It was physical, invasive, and designed to prepare her for what Roman law required to happen next. Standing in that torchlit room, surrounded by strangers whose job was to watch and remember everything they witnessed, the young bride would finally understand why her mother had cried that morning. She would realize why the older women in her family had exchanged those meaningful glances whenever wedding nights were mentioned. And she would discover that becoming a Roman wife meant submitting to procedures that prioritized legal documentation over human dignity. What happened next would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life, but she would never speak of it to anyone, not even her own daughters, when their wedding days arrived. This silence was not unusual. It was universal. Roman women carried these experiences alone, creating a conspiracy of silence that lasted for centuries and allowed these practices to continue generation after generation. The rituals that followed the bride's encounter with the wooden idol were even more invasive and humiliating, involving medical examinations conducted in front of witnesses and consummation procedures that bore no resemblance to anything we would recognize as intimacy or love. Every aspect of the process was designed to create legal evidence that could withstand scrutiny in Roman courts, where disputes over inheritance and legitimacy could drag on for years. But we're just getting started. What you've heard so far is only the beginning of this disturbing story. The actual rituals that took place in that torchlit chamber were so shocking that early Christian writers refused to describe them directly, referring to them only in vague terms that conveyed their horror without providing explicit details. These practices continued for nearly 1,000 years, shaping the lives of countless Roman women whose experiences have been largely erased from historical memory. In the next part of this investigation, we'll uncover exactly what happened when that cloth was finally lifted, revealing the wooden figure that would play such a central role in the bride's initiation into Roman marriage. We'll explore the medical examinations that followed, conducted by physicians whose job was to document every aspect of the bride's physical condition before and after consummation. And we'll discover how these practices were finally brought to an end, not by Roman lawmakers who decided they had gone too far, but by Christian reformers who worked systematically to erase every trace of these rituals from historical memory. The story of Roman wedding night ceremonies reveals a side of ancient civilization that challenges our romanticized view of classical antiquity. Behind the marble columns and philosophical treatises lay a legal system that treated women as property to be verified and transferred according to strict procedures that prioritized documentation over dignity. Understanding these practices helps us comprehend not just Roman marriage law, but the broader question of how entire civilizations can normalize practices that later generations find utterly unacceptable. The moment had arrived. As the bronze doors sealed shut behind the wedding procession, cutting off the sounds of celebration from the streets outside, Claudia found herself standing in an atrium that felt more like a courtroom than a home. The flickering oil lamps cast long shadows across faces she did not recognize, each person present for reasons that were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly terrifying. The pronuba stepped forward, her weathered hands clasping Claudia's wrists with surprising strength. This elderly woman had overseen countless wedding nights throughout her career, and her practiced efficiency spoke of rituals performed so many times that they had become routine. But for Claudia, nothing about this moment felt routine. Everything felt wrong, invasive, designed to strip away not just her clothing, but her humanity itself. The priest began chanting in Latin so archaic that even educated Romans struggled to understand its meaning. These were formulas passed down from the earliest days of the Republic, when marriage ceremonies had been even more brutal and explicit than they were now. The words themselves seemed to carry weight, pressing down on Claudia's shoulders like invisible chains that grew heavier with each syllable. But it was the draped figure in the corner that commanded her attention. Even covered by heavy cloth, its shape was unmistakable, deliberately carved to represent male anatomy in proportions that made its purpose clear. This was no small fertility charm or garden decoration. This was a full-sized idol, nearly 4 feet tall, crafted with anatomical accuracy that left nothing to imagination and everything to dread. The slaves moved with practiced precision, lighting additional lamps and arranging basins of warm water scented with oils that carried religious significance. Their movements were choreographed, each action serving a specific purpose in the elaborate ceremony that was about to unfold. They had performed these same duties countless times before, for countless other brides who had stood in this same position, wearing the same expression of growing horror. Roman religious texts, the few that survived Christian purges, describe mutinous Tutinus as a deity of sexual initiation, whose worship required direct physical contact between devotees and his sacred symbols. Unlike other Roman gods who could be honored through prayers or offerings, this particular divine figure demanded something more intimate, more invasive, more permanently scarring for those required to participate in his rites. The pronuba began explaining what would happen next, her voice steady and matter-of-fact, as if describing the weather or discussing household management. Claudia would be required to approach the idol, remove specific garments, and demonstrate her submission to the god through acts that the pronuba described using clinical terminology that somehow made everything sound even more disturbing than if she had been explicit. These requirements were not suggestions or traditions that could be modified based on the bride's comfort level. They were legal necessities, mandated by Roman marriage law and enforced by the very witnesses who now surrounded Claudia in this torch-lit chamber. Refusal meant the marriage contract would be declared invalid, the bride would be returned to her father's house in disgrace, and her family would face social ruin that could last for generations. The physician stepped forward, unrolling a leather case that contained instruments Claudia had never seen before. His role in the ceremony was to conduct examinations both before and after the ritual consummation, documenting the bride's physical condition with the same clinical detachment he might use when inspecting livestock at market. These medical records would be preserved and could be summoned as evidence in legal proceedings for years to come. Roman legal scholars were explicit about why such documentation was necessary. Marriage represented a transfer of valuable property from one family to another, and like all significant transactions, it required verification that could withstand legal challenges. The bride's virginity was an asset being purchased, and Roman law demanded proof that this asset was authentic and undamaged before the transaction was completed. The examination process itself was conducted with witnesses present, their testimony forming part of the permanent legal record. Modern readers recoil at such invasive procedures, but Romans viewed them as practical necessities, no different from having surveyors inspect land boundaries before finalizing a property sale. The bride's emotional state during these examinations was considered irrelevant, her comfort level a luxury that Roman law could not afford to consider. As the pronuba guided Claudia toward the draped idol, the young bride finally understood the full horror of what Roman marriage truly entailed. This was not a celebration of love, or even a business arrangement between families. This was a systematic process designed to break down resistance, document submission, and create legal evidence that could never be challenged or disputed. The cloth covering the wooden figure seemed to pulse in the lamplight, as if the thing beneath was alive and waiting. Claudia's hands trembled as she reached toward the fabric, knowing that once she lifted it, there would be no path backward, no escape from what Roman society demanded of its wives. The witnesses leaned closer, their eyes fixed on her every movement, ready to remember and record everything they saw. When the covering finally fell away, revealing the carved wooden phallus in all its anatomically explicit detail, Claudia felt something inside her die. This was not worship. This was not tradition. This was humiliation refined into ritual form, designed to ensure that every Roman bride understood exactly how powerless she was in the face of male authority backed by religious sanction and legal requirement. The idol stood there like an accusation, its wooden surface polished smooth by the hands of countless previous brides who had been forced to interact with it in ways that defied every instinct of self-preservation and dignity. Roman writers who mentioned these practices at all did so in language so veiled that later scholars would spend centuries trying to decode exactly what they meant. But the physical evidence was unmistakable. Archaeological excavations have uncovered similar wooden figures in Roman households throughout the empire, always found in rooms associated with marriage ceremonies, always carved with the same disturbing attention to anatomical detail. These were not abstract symbols or artistic representations. They were functional objects designed for specific ritual purposes that required direct physical contact between the bride and the sacred wood. The pronuba's instructions became more specific now, her voice never wavering despite the horror of what she was describing. Claudia would need to demonstrate her submission to the god through acts that combined religious observance with sexual initiation, all while witnesses observed and the physician prepared to document the physical evidence of her compliance. Every aspect of the ritual served multiple purposes within Roman legal and religious frameworks. But this was only the beginning. The encounter with mutinous Teutonus represented just the first stage of wedding night procedures that would continue throughout the hours of darkness, each phase more invasive than the last, each ritual designed to strip away another layer of the bride's autonomy and dignity. By dawn, she would be legally transformed from virgin daughter to married woman, but the psychological scars would remain for the rest of her life. The most disturbing aspect of these ceremonies was not their explicit nature, but their systematic quality. This was not random cruelty or individual sadism. This was institutional practice, refined over centuries, supported by religious authority and legal precedent. Generations of Roman families had participated in these rituals, viewing them as necessary components of proper marriage procedures rather than traumatic ordeals that violated basic human dignity. Standing before the wooden idol with witnesses watching her every movement, Claudia represented countless Roman women whose wedding night experiences have been erased from historical memory. Their stories were never recorded because their thoughts and feelings were considered irrelevant to the legal processes being conducted through their bodies. They existed to serve as vessels for family honor and legal documentation, their personal experiences dismissed as unimportant side effects of necessary procedures. The lamplight flickered across the carved wooden surface as the pronuba positioned Claudia according to ritual requirements. The physician readied his instruments. The witnesses prepared to observe and remember, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the bronze doors, the sounds of wedding celebration continued. The guests outside completely unaware of the systematic brutality being conducted in the name of Roman law and religious tradition. What happened next would haunt Claudia for the rest of her life, but she would never speak of it, not even to her own daughters when their wedding days arrived. This silence was not coincidental. It was essential to the system's survival, ensuring that each new generation of brides entered marriage completely unprepared for the realities they would face, unable to resist procedures they had never imagined possible. The ritual began with deliberate slowness, each movement choreographed to maximize the psychological impact on the trembling bride. The pronuba's weathered hands guided Claudia's shaking fingers toward the wooden surface, her voice maintaining that same clinical tone that somehow made everything more terrifying than outright cruelty would have been. This was business. Roman efficiency applied to the systematic destruction of innocence. The carved idol demanded more than simple acknowledgement. Roman religious law required physical interaction, contact that left no doubt about the bride's submission to divine authority, as interpreted through male religious hierarchy. The wooden surface, polished smooth by generations of terrified young women, gleamed in the lamplight like some grotesque altar demanding sacrifice. Contemporary Roman writers who dared reference these ceremonies used language so deliberately obscure that modern scholars still debate their exact meaning. Phrases like, "The bride must seat herself upon the sacred symbol," and "she shall demonstrate her acceptance of divine penetration," appear in religious texts, their clinical phrasing masking procedures that were anything but clinical in their psychological impact. The physician observed everything with the detached interest of a man conducting livestock inspection. His leather pouch contained instruments designed specifically for documenting virginity before ritual contact and recording evidence of compliance afterward. These medical examinations represented Roman legal thoroughness taken to its most invasive extreme, treating human bodies as property requiring detailed cataloguing. Roman marriage contracts often included specific clauses about wedding night verification, with financial penalties for families who failed to provide adequate documentation of consummation. The bride's physical condition became a matter of commercial importance, her body reduced to inventory that required professional assessment and legal certification. The slaves moved around the chamber with practiced efficiency, adjusting lamp positions to ensure adequate lighting for witness observation, preparing warmed oils for post-ritual cleansing, and arranging the medical instruments in order of their intended use. Their choreographed movements spoke of ceremonies performed countless times, each wedding night following identical patterns refined over centuries of institutional practice. But it was the silence of the witnesses that proved most unsettling. These men and women watched the proceedings with the same dispassionate attention they might bring to observing a business transaction or religious sacrifice. Their job was to remember everything, to provide testimony if the marriage's validity was ever questioned, to serve as human documentation of procedures too sensitive to commit to written records. The pronuba began positioning Claudia according to requirements that seemed designed more to humiliate than to serve any practical religious purpose. The bride's posture, the angle of her approach, the duration of contact, even the specific prayers she was required to recite while interacting with the wooden idol, all followed patterns established by generations of religious authorities who had refined degradation into sacred duty. Roman legal texts, preserved in monastery libraries, reveal the systematic nature of these requirements. Brides from patrician families faced more elaborate rituals than those from plebeian households, their higher social status paradoxically subjecting them to more invasive procedures. The wealthy purchased more thorough humiliation, their marriage contracts demanding additional witnesses and more detailed medical documentation. The carved wooden phallus stood nearly 4 feet tall, its proportions deliberately exaggerated beyond normal human anatomy. This was not meant to represent any individual man, but rather to embody masculine authority in its most threatening form. The idol's size ensured that no bride could mistake its symbolic meaning or minimize the physical reality of what submission to it entailed. Archaeological evidence from Roman villa excavations supports the literary references to these ceremonies. Hidden chambers adjacent to wedding quarters contain altars clearly designed for fertility rituals, with wooden fragments showing tool marks consistent with phallic carving. Stone basins found in these rooms bear chemical traces of oils used in purification ceremonies, while metal fragments match descriptions of medical instruments used for bridal examination. The religious justification for these practices drew upon Roman beliefs about divine intervention in human fertility. Mutinus Tutinus was considered a guardian deity who protected marriages from sterility and ensured the production of legitimate heirs. But his protection came at a price that fell exclusively on women, their bodies serving as the interface between human desire and divine approval. Roman religious authorities argued that brides who properly submitted to the god's requirements would enjoy blessed marriages with abundant children, while those who resisted or showed insufficient enthusiasm would face divine punishment in the form of barrenness or difficult births. This theological framework transformed compliance into religious duty and resistance into impiety, punishable by both earthly and divine authority. The physician stepped forward as the ritual with the wooden idol concluded, his clinical examination beginning while the bride remained in position. His documentation served multiple purposes within Roman legal framework, establishing baseline physical condition, confirming ritual compliance, and creating evidence that could later support claims about legitimacy of offspring produced by the marriage. These medical procedures were conducted without regard for the bride's comfort or dignity, the physician's hands moving with the same detachment he might show when examining any other piece of valuable property. His findings were recorded in Latin terminology that reduced the bride's body to a collection of technical observations suitable for legal testimony. The witnesses observed every aspect of the examination with careful attention, their presence transforming what might have been a private medical consultation into a public legal procedure. Roman law required their testimony to establish beyond doubt that proper procedures had been followed and that the bride had been found suitable for marriage according to established standards, but the night's ordeals were far from complete. The examination following the ritual represented only one phase of verification procedures that would continue until dawn. The actual consummation still awaited, along with additional medical documentation and witness testimony that would finalize the legal transformation from virgin daughter to married woman. The pronuba guided Claudia toward the bedchamber that had been prepared for the marriage's physical completion. The room's arrangement followed strict traditional requirements, with the bed positioned to allow clear observation from the doorway and oil lamps placed to provide adequate illumination for witness documentation. Privacy was not merely absent, but actively prevented by religious and legal requirements. Roman marriage law recognized no distinction between public ceremony and private intimacy. Every aspect of the wedding night served legal purposes that required witness observation and professional documentation. The bride's feelings about these arrangements were considered irrelevant to procedures designed to protect family honor and ensure dynastic continuity. The bedchamber's staging revealed the systematic nature of Roman wedding night rituals. Specific oils had been prepared for various phases of the evening. Different sets of linens were ready for before and after documentation, and the physician's instruments were arranged within easy reach for periodic examinations throughout the night. Marcus finally appeared in the doorway, his face betraying emotions that Claudia had not expected to see. This man who legally owned her now, who could do anything he wished with her body, looked almost as uncomfortable as she felt. His hesitation suggested that even Roman husbands found these elaborate verification procedures distasteful, but legal requirements left them no choice but to participate. The pronuba's authority extended beyond ritual supervision to include detailed instruction for both bride and groom during consummation. Her presence transformed what should have been intimate moments into educational demonstrations, with corrections and adjustments made according to traditional requirements that prioritized legal documentation over human emotion. Everything that happened in that torchlit chamber served the broader purpose of creating unshakable evidence that the marriage had been properly consummated according to Roman law. The bride's virginity before, the couple's compliance during, and the physical evidence afterward all became part of a legal record that could withstand challenges for generations to come. The systematic nature of these procedures reveals how thoroughly Roman society had institutionalized the treatment of women as property requiring verification and documentation. What feels like individual cruelty to modern sensibilities was actually bureaucratic efficiency applied to human sexuality, reducing the most intimate human experiences to matters of legal procedure and commercial transaction. As dawn approached, and the final medical examinations concluded, Claudia officially became a Roman wife. But the psychological transformation was far more complex than the legal one. Her identity forever shaped by wedding night experiences that she would carry in silence for the rest of her life, never speaking of them even to her own daughters when their wedding days arrived. The morning light filtering through the bronze shutters revealed a different person than the frightened girl who had entered that chamber the night before. Claudia lay motionless on the marriage bed, staring at the painted ceiling frescoes that depicted scenes of mythological romance. Their cheerful imagery, a grotesque mockery of what she had actually endured. The slaves moved quietly around the room, collecting blood-stained linens that would be preserved as legal evidence, their faces betraying no emotion about the systematic brutality they had witnessed throughout the night. The physician completed his final examination with the same clinical detachment he had shown hours earlier, his instruments clicking softly as he documented the physical evidence of consummation. Every mark, every tear, every indication of what had transpired became part of an official record that would be sealed and stored in the family archives, ready to be produced if anyone ever questioned the validity of this marriage or the legitimacy of children it might produce. The pronuba supervised the collection of evidence with practiced efficiency, ensuring that nothing was overlooked or improperly documented. The bloodied sheets were carefully folded and placed in cedar boxes treated with preservatives. The oils used during various phases of the ceremony were sealed in amphorae marked with specific dates and witness signatures. Even the wooden idol was ceremonially cleansed and returned to its sacred storage place, ready for the next bride who would be forced to acknowledge its authority. What struck Claudia most profoundly was not the physical pain, though that was considerable, but the complete absence of any acknowledgement that she was a human being with thoughts, feelings, or rights. Throughout the entire ordeal, she had been treated as an object being processed through a series of legal requirements. Her tears had been ignored. Her obvious distress had been irrelevant. Her whispered pleas for gentleness had been dismissed as inappropriate interference with necessary procedures. The witnesses began departing as the sun rose higher, each one carrying sworn testimony about what they had observed. These men and women would return to their normal lives, perhaps attending gladiatorial games or dinner parties later that same day, carrying memories of a young woman's systematic degradation as casually as they might remember the weather or their breakfast. For them, this had been routine civic duty, as unremarkable as serving jury duty or paying taxes. But for generations of Roman brides, these wedding night experiences created a shared trauma that bound women together in silent understanding. Mothers could not warn their daughters explicitly about what awaited them, because speaking of the rituals in detail was considered improper and potentially legally dangerous. Instead, they communicated through meaningful glances, trembling hands, while braiding wedding hair, and cryptic warnings about submission and endurance. Roman medical texts from the imperial period contain detailed descriptions of treating wedding night injuries that modern physicians recognize as symptoms of sexual trauma. These documents, preserved in monastery libraries throughout Europe, reveal the systematic nature of damage inflicted on young brides through ritualized violence disguised as religious ceremony and legal necessity. The clinical language cannot disguise the human suffering documented in case after case of torn tissue, severe bleeding, and psychological shock. The economic aspects of these practices were as carefully calculated as their legal implications. Roman marriage contracts often included specific financial penalties for brides who failed to comply with wedding night requirements or who showed insufficient enthusiasm during witness observation. Families paid substantial sums to ensure their daughters received proper ritual preparation, viewing the expense as necessary investment in securing advantageous marriages and protecting dynastic interests. Professional wedding night supervisors like the praenuba commanded high fees for their expertise in conducting these ceremonies according to established legal and religious standards. Their training included detailed knowledge of anatomical verification techniques, proper ritual positioning, appropriate prayers and incantations, and the precise documentation required to create legally unassailable evidence of consummation and compliance. The psychological conditioning that prepared Roman girls for these experiences began in early childhood through exposure to religious festivals and artistic depictions that normalized extreme sexual violence as divine will. Temple murals showed gods assaulting mortal women, while household shrines displayed phallic symbols that young girls were taught to revere as sources of fertility and protection. This cultural programming made resistance seem not just futile, but impious. Archaeological excavations of Roman wedding chambers have revealed architectural features specifically designed to facilitate witness observation and medical examination. Hidden alcoves allowed observers to watch without interfering, while adjustable lamp systems provided optimal lighting for documentation purposes. Some chambers contained restraining devices disguised as decorative elements, their true purpose becoming clear only when examined alongside contemporary legal texts describing proper wedding night procedures. The religious authorities who sanctioned these practices drew upon theological arguments that portrayed women as inherently chaotic forces requiring masculine control to achieve divine order. This philosophical framework transformed systematic abuse into sacred duty, making resistance equivalent to rebellion against both human and divine authority. Priests who supervised wedding night ceremonies held recognized positions within Roman religious hierarchy, their expertise in degradation rituals earning them social respect and financial reward. Roman legal scholars developed elaborate theoretical justifications for wedding night verification procedures, arguing that marriage represented such a fundamental transformation of social relationships that extraordinary measures were necessary to ensure its validity. Their treatises, preserved in Byzantine legal collections, reveal sophisticated reasoning that reduced human suffering to acceptable costs of maintaining social order and protecting family honor. The international reputation of Roman wedding practices spread throughout the Mediterranean world, influencing marriage customs in conquered territories and allied kingdoms. Foreign ambassadors reported these ceremonies to their home governments with mixtures of fascination and horror, their diplomatic correspondence providing some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of rituals that Roman writers preferred to discuss only obliquely. But resistance existed, even within the rigid constraints of Roman society. Some wealthy families hired professional mourners to attend wedding ceremonies, their ritual weeping providing culturally acceptable outlet for grief about what was being done to their daughters. Other families developed coded languages that allowed women to communicate about their experiences without violating legal prohibitions against explicit discussion of wedding night procedures. Underground networks of women provided practical support for brides recovering from wedding night trauma, sharing knowledge about herbal remedies for physical injuries and emotional healing techniques passed down through generations of survivors. These informal support systems operated entirely outside official Roman institutions, their existence revealed only through scattered references in private letters and medical prescriptions found in household ruins. The Christian transformation of Roman marriage practices began slowly and faced enormous resistance from established religious and legal authorities who profited from existing systems. Early Christian writers focused their attacks on the most obviously pagan aspects of wedding ceremonies, particularly the worship of fertility deities like Mutinus Tutinus, while initially showing less concern about the systematic abuse of women that formed the core of these rituals. The theological debates that eventually led to reformed marriage practices centered on questions of human dignity and divine purpose rather than women's rights, which remained an inconceivable concept throughout the transition period. Christian reformers argued that souls destined for eternal life deserved different treatment than property being transferred between owners, but their reasoning focused on spiritual rather than earthly considerations. The practical elimination of Roman wedding night rituals required more than theological argument. It demanded systematic destruction of physical evidence, rewriting of legal codes, training of new religious authorities, and creation of alternative ceremonies that served similar social functions without the explicit brutality. This transformation took centuries to complete and was never entirely successful in eliminating all traces of the older practices. Archaeological evidence suggests that modified versions of Roman wedding night rituals persisted in remote areas of the empire well into the medieval period, adapting to Christian terminology while maintaining their essential character of systematic female subordination, disguised as a religious ceremony. These hybrid practices combined Christian marriage vows with pagan verification procedures, creating theological contradictions that troubled church authorities for generations. The documentary evidence for these practices comes primarily from three sources that survived systematic destruction attempts. Legal texts preserved verification procedures as matter of jurisprudential precedent. Medical writings documented treatment protocols for wedding night injuries. And polemical Christian literature condemned pagan rituals in language that revealed their actual nature despite attempts at euphemistic description. Modern historians have struggled to acknowledge the full extent of Roman wedding night brutality, because doing so challenges romanticized views of classical civilization that have dominated Western education for centuries. The same culture that produced magnificent architecture, sophisticated philosophy, and advanced engineering also systematically traumatized its women through institutionalized sexual violence disguised as legal and religious necessity. The silence that surrounded these practices in Roman society continues to influence how they are remembered today. Just as Roman women could not speak openly about their wedding night experiences, modern scholars often minimize or euphemize descriptions of rituals that seem incompatible with admiration for classical achievements in other areas of human endeavor. But understanding these practices is essential for comprehending the full reality of Roman civilization and its treatment of women as legal property requiring verification and documentation. The systematic nature of wedding night procedures reveals how thoroughly patriarchal authority penetrated every aspect of Roman life, transforming even the most intimate human experiences into opportunities for demonstrating male dominance and female submission. The women who endured these rituals, from Claudia to countless others whose names were never recorded, represent a hidden history of suffering that shaped Roman society as profoundly as its military conquests or architectural achievements. Their silence was not consent, but survival strategy. Their compliance, not approval, but recognition that resistance meant social death in a world that offered women no alternative to marriage and motherhood under male authority. The terrifying wedding night ritual that Rome tried to erase from history succeeded in its immediate purpose of creating legally unassailable evidence of marriage consummation while simultaneously traumatizing generations of women into accepting their status as property rather than people. The psychological impact of these experiences extended far beyond individual suffering to shape entire cultural attitudes about women's roles, rights, and value within Roman society. As we approach the final revelation of how these practices were eventually eliminated, we must remember that their disappearance came not from Roman recognition of their cruelty, but from external pressure applied by religious reformers who opposed them for theological rather than humanitarian reasons. The systematic abuse of Roman brides ended not because Romans decided women deserved better treatment, but because Christians needed different rituals to support their own vision of social order and divine purpose. Purpose. The transformation began in the shadows of Christian monasteries, where scribes worked methodically to rewrite history itself. These weren't random acts of censorship, but coordinated campaigns to eliminate every trace of wedding night rituals that had defined Roman marriage for nearly a millennium. The process was as systematic as the brutality it sought to erase, involving the deliberate destruction of legal documents, the defacement of religious artwork, and the silencing of witnesses who might preserve dangerous memories. Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century marked the beginning of the end for practices that had seemed as permanent as the marble columns of the Pantheon. But change came slowly, fought at every step by aristocratic families who viewed traditional wedding ceremonies as essential components of their social status and legal security. The resistance was fierce because these rituals served purposes that extended far beyond religious observance into the fundamental structures of Roman power and wealth. Christian bishops found themselves caught between theological conviction and practical politics. They condemned the worship of fertility deities like Mutinus Tutinus as blasphemous paganism, but they needed alternative systems for verifying marriage legitimacy and ensuring proper inheritance lines. The solution they developed was equally invasive, but clothed in different religious language, substituting Christian prayers for pagan incantations while maintaining many of the same verification procedures. The theological arguments that eventually prevailed focused on the concept of sacramental marriage as a reflection of Christ's relationship with the Church. This metaphor required mutual consent and spiritual equality that was incompatible with treating brides as property being inspected and transferred. But the transition from pagan to Christian marriage practices took generations to complete and was never uniform across the empire's vast territories. Regional variations in wedding night procedures persisted well into the medieval period, with some areas maintaining modified versions of Roman rituals under Christian terminology. Archaeological evidence from 6th and 7th century burial sites suggests that wooden fertility idols continue to be used in remote provinces. Their pagan origins disguised through superficial Christian symbolism and recontextualized prayers. The systematic destruction of evidence began with imperial edicts ordering the removal of phallic imagery from public spaces and private homes. Statues of mutinous Teutonus were smashed or buried, temple murals were plastered over, and household shrines were dismantled. But the most effective censorship targeted written records, with Christian authorities confiscating and destroying legal documents that described wedding night verification procedures in explicit detail. Monastic libraries became repositories for carefully edited versions of Roman legal texts, with passages describing bridal examination procedures either removed entirely or rewritten in language so obscure that later readers could not decipher their original meaning. This editorial process created gaps in historical knowledge that persist today, leaving modern scholars to reconstruct ancient practices from scattered fragments and coded references. The women who had endured these rituals found themselves in a peculiar position during the Christian transformation period. Their traumatic experiences suddenly became evidence of pagan corruption rather than normal marriage procedures. But they still could not speak openly about what they had suffered without violating new Christian standards of modesty and propriety. The silence that had protected the old system now served to obscure its memory under the new one. The empire that gave the world law and order built that foundation on the systematic brutalization of its most vulnerable citizens. Claudia's story represents thousands of nameless women whose wedding nights became legal procedures designed to strip away their humanity in service of male authority. The terrifying truth Rome tried so desperately to erase reminds us that civilizations can normalize any cruelty when it serves their power structures, and that progress comes not from recognizing our own virtue, but from confronting the uncomfortable realities of what we're capable of.